I was still in my scrubs when my mother called to remind me not to mention my job at Sunday dinner because, and I quote, "it makes your cousin's husband feel inadequate." I almost laughed. Almost. 3 months earlier, I had been named the youngest attending physician in the cardiology department at St. Aurelius Medical Center. I had just led a 6-person research team through the final trial of a non-invasive diagnostic protocol that the American Heart Association had requested to review for national publication. I was 32 years old, running on 4 hours of sleep and hospital cafeteria coffee, and I was being asked to dim my light so a man I had met twice wouldn't feel bad about himself at a family potluck. I said, "Sure, Mom." And then I pulled into the driveway of my aunt's house and sat in my car for 4 minutes, staring at the porch wreath that had been up since Christmas. The dinner was for my cousin's birthday. My cousin, I'll call her my cousin because that's the only way I think about her, even now, is sweet in that particular way that means she absorbs whatever energy is around her. She's 26. She married a man named Holden 8 months ago in a ceremony I attended alone, flew back from a conference in Denver, specifically to be there, sat in the 3rd row and cried a little because she looked genuinely happy. Holden is 31. He sells medical devices for a mid-tier distributor. He knows enough terminology to sound impressive at dinner tables, and not enough to know when someone else in the room knows more. I know exactly what kind of man he is because I trained with men like him. They haunted the edges of every hospital orientation, every grand rounds, every pharmaceutical lunch, confident in rooms where no one could check them, uncomfortable in rooms where someone could. My aunt opened the door before I knocked. "Sweetheart," she said, and pulled me into a hug that was 3 seconds too long in the way that means pity rather than warmth. "We're so glad you came. You look exhausted." "Long week," I said. Of course, of course." She took my coat. "I was just telling everyone, the hours those hospitals make you work, it's criminal, honestly." "No wonder you've been so," she buzzed, searching for the word. Withdrawn. I had not been withdrawn. I had been unreachable because I was finishing a research paper covering 2 colleagues who were out with the flu and managing a patient whose family flew in from 3 states away. But in my family's narrative, any absence reads as struggle. I carried the wine I'd brought into the kitchen and found my mother at the island, slicing bread. She looked up, gave me a look that said please behave, and handed me a glass of water. "Holden's already here," she said quietly. "He's in a mood. Try not to set him off." I wasn't planning to say anything to him. "I know, but you have a way of." She waved the bread knife vaguely. "Just be soft, okay? It's your cousin's birthday." I nodded. "I am not a person who starts fights. I am a person who finishes them, which is a different thing entirely, and my family has never quite understood the distinction." The living room was full in the comfortable, loud way of a family that genuinely likes each other even when they're being awful. My aunt had put out the good napkins. There were kids somewhere upstairs making the kind of noise that means someone is definitely going to cry in 40 minutes. My cousin came around the corner and hugged me, and she smelled like the same vanilla lotion she's used since high school. And I felt, briefly and painfully, how much I missed her. "You made it," she said. "I made it," I said. "Happy birthday. You look wonderful." She did. She was glowing in the specific way that made me think she might have news, but I didn't ask. Holden was standing near the fireplace with 2 of my uncles, holding a beer, doing the thing where you position your body like a TED Talk. I caught his eye when I walked in. He gave me a nod that was just short of dismissive. "Dr. Reyes," he said. "My last name, not my first," like a joke with no punchline. "Holden," I said pleasantly. "How's work?" "Incredible, actually." He said it like he'd been waiting. "Just closed the biggest quarter in my territory's history. Cardiology division." He said the last part while looking directly at me. "Your department actually uses some of our equipment. Pretty wild, right?" "Is that right?" I said. "Yeah, we supply the imaging software to 3 hospitals in the metro area. St. Aurelius is one of them." He tilted his head. "You probably use it every day and don't even think about where it comes from." I thought about where it came from. I also thought about the 18-month pilot evaluation I had personally written the assessment for. the one that had flagged significant latency issues in his company's software under high-volume conditions, the one that had resulted in St. Aurelius renewing with a different vendor 4 weeks ago. But I smiled and said, "You're probably right." He moved on. He always moves on when he doesn't get a reaction. It's the tell of someone who performs for an audience, not a conversation. Dinner was laid out buffet style, which I appreciated because it meant I could find a chair at the edge of things and just be present without being interrogated. My aunt sat at the head. My cousin was at her side and Holden was next to her. And then there were cousins and aunts and uncles and the kids who had come downstairs and a neighbor who had apparently been invited at the last minute because she'd just gone through a divorce. And my aunt felt bad. For 20 minutes it was fine. People talked about a renovation project, about a road trip someone was planning, about whether the elementary school was going to redistrict. Normal, manageable family dinner noise. Then Holden cleared his throat. "I actually have some news," he said, and my cousin put her hand on his arm and smiled, and I thought, please let this be about the baby. And it was not about the baby. "I've been recruited," he said. "Headhunted, actually. There's a medical technology firm, Vantara Health Systems. You've probably heard of them. They're expanding their cardiology division nationally. VP of Strategic Sales, corner office, team of 12. He let that land. "I haven't accepted yet, but it's basically a formality." The table responded the way tables respond to this kind of announcement. "Congratulations, that's amazing. Tell us more." "Vantara is doing some groundbreaking stuff," he continued. "They just landed a federal contract for diagnostic integration across VA hospitals. That's going to touch every major cardiology center in the country." He looked at me with something that was almost kind. "I might actually be able to throw some work your way once I'm in." Consultants, liaisons, they're always looking for physicians who want to pivot when the clinical side gets to be too much. The table went quiet for a beat in the way it does when someone has said something that technically sounds generous and actually isn't. My mother was looking at her plate. My aunt said, "Isn't that thoughtful?" I said. "That's very generous, Holden, and I meant 0% of it." And then I asked my cousin how she was feeling and let the conversation turn. But something had shifted in me. Not anger, exactly. More like the moment when a diagnosis you suspected gets confirmed. You're not surprised. You're just now dealing with reality instead of possibility. Because here is what I knew about Vantara Health Systems that Holden did not know I knew. I was on their medical advisory board. Had been for 14 months. I had been invited by their chief medical officer, a woman I'd worked with during my fellowship, after my research on non-invasive cardiac diagnostics started getting attention. I attended quarterly reviews. I had a badge. I had a login to their internal portal. I had, 6 weeks ago, been CC'd on the communications about their national cardiology expansion, which included a note about restructuring their sales leadership. I also knew that the VP of Strategic Sales position he was describing was currently on hold. The reason it was on hold was because their previous VP had been let go after a client raised concerns about misrepresented product capabilities during a procurement process. Vantara was being careful. They were requiring all candidates to pass a technical competency review, an unusual step for a sales role, but one their CMO had insisted on after the last situation. I had helped design the review framework. I looked at Holden across the table, laughing at something my uncle said, and I thought, he has no idea. I excused myself to get more water. In the kitchen, I pulled out my phone and checked my email. There was one from Vantara's head of HR, sent 3 days ago, with a candidate list for the VP role attached. I scrolled to the names. Holden's name was on it. Final round. Interview scheduled for Thursday at 11 a.m. I stood in my aunt's kitchen for a long moment, listening to the laughter from the dining room. Then I refilled my water glass, walked back to the table, and said nothing. The rest of the evening was a sustained low-grade exercise in endurance. My aunt asked Holden 3 separate times to elaborate on the Vantara opportunity. Each time he did, the details got slightly more embellished. The team of 12 became a division. The corner office became a floor. He mentioned, twice, that Vantara's compensation packages were in the top 10% of the industry, and once, While I was reaching for the salad bowl, he said, "Honestly, at a certain point, the clinical track just caps out. There's a ceiling. Sales, operations, strategy, that's where the real money is." Nobody looked at me, which meant everyone was thinking about me. My cousin touched my arm quietly when she passed me on the way to the kitchen. "He doesn't mean it how it sounds," she murmured. "I know," I said. And I didn't say anything else because it wasn't her fault and it was her birthday and she was the only person at that table who had actually asked me last month how I was doing, really, and listened to the answer. I left at 8:30. I hugged my cousin, told her I'd call her this week, and meant it. I shook hands with Holden, who gripped a little too hard, the way men do when they're making a point. "Good to see you, Dr. Reyes," he said. "You too," I said. "Good luck Thursday." Something flickered across his face, gone before I could name it. I drove home thinking not about revenge. That's not the right word for what I was feeling. I was thinking about integrity, about what it meant that this man was walking into a process I had helped build, carrying credentials I had no reason to trust, going for a role that would put him in contact with cardiology departments across the country, including mine, including the hospitals that served my patients. I was thinking about what it meant to stay quiet. I got home, made tea, opened my laptop, and pulled up the Vantara Advisory Board portal. I sent a message to their head of HR flagging a potential conflict of interest. I had a personal connection to one of the final candidates and wanted to disclose it before Thursday. And I'd also like to flag some questions about credential verification that I thought the committee should consider given the nature of the role. She called me the next morning. I explained carefully and without any personal animus. Because I didn't feel personal animus, I felt professional concern that I had encountered the candidate socially and had reason to believe his technical claims should be scrutinized. I didn't say he was lying. I said that the competency framework we'd designed existed precisely for moments like this, and I thought it was worth applying it rigorously. She agreed. She asked if I would be willing to sit in on the technical review portion of Thursday's interview. I said I would. I want to be clear about something. I did not walk into that conference room wanting to humiliate Holden. That is genuinely true. I walked in because the alternative was to stay quiet, while a man who'd spent half of my cousin's birthday dinner implying I'd hit a ceiling got handed a role that would affect real patients at real hospitals. I had helped build the standard. I was obligated to apply it. But I will also not pretend I didn't feel something when the conference room door opened and he walked in. He had on a very nice suit. His postures was immaculate. He shook hands with everyone at the table with the ease of someone who has done this many times and has never been seriously challenged. He sat down, adjusted his jacket, opened his portfolio. Then he looked up and saw me. The portfolio closed, not dramatically, just his hands pressing together on top of it, very still. "Holden," I said. My voice was exactly the same as it had been at my aunt's dinner table. "Welcome. I'm sitting in on the technical review portion today on behalf of the Medical Advisory Board. You know everyone else?" He said he did. His voice was level. He was trying very hard. The first 40 minutes went reasonably well for him. Questions about sales strategy, territory management, client relationship building. He was genuinely good at those. I watched the two members of the search committee nodding along and understood completely how he had made it to the final round. Then it was my turn. "Holden, your materials reference extensive experience with clinical workflow integration in high-volume cardiology settings," I said. "Can you walk me through a specific example, facility name, the integration challenge, and what metric you use to evaluate success?" He gave me an example. It was textbook. The facility name was real. I happened to know the facility. I also happened to know that the integration project he described had been managed entirely by the hospital's internal IT team. The vendor, his company, had provided hardware and a 6-week setup liaison. Standard implementation, not a workflow integration, not in any meaningful clinical sense. I asked a follow-up question. Specific, technical, the kind that requires you to have been in the room. He started to answer and stopped. "I want to make sure I'm being precise," he said. "Please," I said. He gave me an answer that was the definition of plausible enough. It used the right words. It demonstrated a working understanding of the surface of the concept without any indication he understood the depth. It was the answer of someone who had read the documentation and hoped no one would ask him to go further. I went further. After the third follow-up question, his eyes moved to mine in a way they hadn't before. Not angry, something closer to recognition. The specific look of someone realizing, belatedly, what room they're actually in. Let's shift to something else, I said. I set down my pen. In your materials, you list familiarity with the Vantara CardiLink integration protocol. That protocol is proprietary. It's not in any public documentation. How are you familiar with it? The room was quiet. I've spoken with some of your current team, he said. In the process of. The protocol is under NDA for all current employees, said the head of HR, gently but clearly. That would be a disclosure issue. I may have the name confused with something similar, he said. His voice had changed. The performance was still there, but something under it had gone hollow. That's possible, I said. Let me ask you something broader then. This role will require you to serve as a technical liaison between Vantara's product team and cardiology department heads at major medical centers. Those department heads will ask you detailed questions. They'll expect you to be able to engage at a clinical level. I paused. Based on what you've shared today, do you feel confident you can do that? He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, I think I may have oversold some aspects of my background. It was the most honest thing I had ever heard him say. The interview ended 20 minutes later. HR thanked him for his time. He stood, picked up his portfolio, and stopped on his way to the door. This was about Sunday dinner, he said. His voice was quiet, not accusatory, just exhausted. This was about a role that affects patient care, I said, but I understand why it feels personal. He left. The head of HR looked at me after the door closed. Thank you for flagging this, she said. That would have been a problem. I know, I said. I drove home a different route than usual, past the hospital, out of habit. I thought about whether I had done the right thing. I thought about it honestly, the way you do with decisions that cost you something. Because I knew this would cost me something. Holden would tell my cousin would tell my aunt. The story would not be he lied about his credentials. The story would be she ambushed him. That's not what happened. But I have learned, slowly and with significant personal evidence, that what happened and what the family believes happened are frequently two different documents. My phone rang that evening while I was eating leftover soup at my kitchen counter. My cousin. I picked it up. He told me, she said. Her voice was strange, flat in a way that could have either direction. I know, I said. I was going to call you. He said you set him up, that you used your position to sabotage him because you've always resented us. That's not what happened. He said you were in the interviews. He said you asked him questions you knew he couldn't answer. He said, her voice cracked. He said you've always looked down on us. I have never looked down on you, I said. Not once. You're the person who called me when I got my fellowship acceptance. You're the only person in this family who has ever asked me what my research is actually about. Silence. He lied on his application, I said. I'm on Vantara's advisory board. I helped design the competency review he had to pass. I disclosed the conflict of interest before the interview. This was not a setup. This was a standard process that he didn't survive because he wasn't qualified for the role. More silence. He claimed familiarity with a proprietary protocol that he couldn't possibly have legitimately known, I said. That alone could have created legal liability for the company. This is not about Sunday dinner. I heard her breathing. He doesn't know you're on their board, she said finally. He never asked, I said. He spent our dinner telling me sales was where the real money was. A long pause. He said some things to me tonight. After he got home, I waited. He was really angry, she said, and her voice went careful in a way that made something sharpen in me. Are you okay? I asked. Yeah, she said quickly. Too quickly. I mean, it's fine. He's just upset. Okay, I said, and then, gently, you know you can call me for anything. Right? Another pause. Yeah, I mean it. I'm 30 minutes away, she said she knew. We stayed on the phone for a little while longer without saying much. She asked how work was going. I told her about a patient who had brought me a card with a drawing his 5-year-old daughter had made of what she imagined a heart looked like. She laughed a little. I told her happy birthday again. She said thank you. She said, I'm sorry I didn't tell you about the advisory board thing sooner. And I realized she didn't mean Vantara. She meant years ago, somewhere earlier. Some missed conversation. Me too, I said. I heard from my aunt 4 days later. A text, not a call, which told me how angry she was, because my aunt processes real fury through text messages so she has time to edit. She said I had embarrassed the family. She said I had used my position to punish Holden for a dinner conversation. She said, this is exactly why you don't have anyone. You care more about being right than being kind. I read it twice. I typed 3 different responses and deleted them all. I finally wrote, I love you. I hope we can talk about this when you're ready. And I put my phone face down and went back to my notes. Being right and being kind are not opposites. They just require different timelines. 2 weeks later, my cousin called again. She asked if she could come over. She arrived at 7 with a bag of groceries and the particular look of someone who has made a decision and is still adjusting to it. She made pasta. I made salad. We ate at my kitchen table for the first time in 3 years, and she told me that she and Holden were separating, that it hadn't been just the job thing, that there were things she hadn't been saying to anyone because she was afraid of what it meant to say them out loud. I listened. I didn't offer opinions she didn't ask for. I got her more water when her glass was empty. At some point she said, You've known for a while, haven't you? That something was off with him. I had a suspicion, I said carefully. Why didn't you say anything? I thought about how to answer that. Because you love him, I said, and you needed to find out yourself. Me saying it before you were ready would just have made you defend him and pushed you further away from me. She was quiet for a moment. That's a very physician thing to say. Probably, I said. She smiled, and it was the first real smile I'd seen from her in months. She slept in my guest room that night, and in the morning I made coffee, and she sat on my kitchen counter, like she used to at my parents' house when we were teenagers, and she told me she was thinking about going back to school. She'd always wanted to do something in healthcare communications. She was good with words. She was good with people. I told her I knew someone who ran a program. I told her I would be happy to make a call. She said, You don't have to do that. I said, I know. As for Holden, he withdrew his application from Vantara the following week. I was informed by HR. I didn't ask for details, and none were offered. I heard through a mutual connection that he'd taken a position at a smaller firm, regional, lower stakes. Whether that's a consequence or just a chapter, I genuinely don't know. That part of the story isn't mine to tell. My aunt and I have not had a real conversation since her text. I've seen her once at a family thing, and we were polite in the way that means we're both waiting for something neither of us has said yet. I think she knows, on some level, that the version of events she was given was incomplete. I think she'll need time to arrive at that on her own. I am patient. I have learned to be. What I know is this. I spent years making myself smaller at family gatherings, deflecting questions about my work, underselling my accomplishments, laughing off comments about ceilings and pivots, and the kind of money you make when you stop being just a doctor. I did it to keep the peace. I did it because I love these people, and I didn't want to be the reason dinner got uncomfortable. And none of it made me beloved. None of it earned me the benefit of the doubt when I went quiet for 6 weeks to submit a research paper. It just meant that when someone needed a narrative about me that made his failure make sense, there was space for one. I'm not making myself smaller anymore. I still take my cousin's calls on the first ring. I still show up. I still carried an extra granola bar in my coat pocket last Tuesday because I knew I was going to see her and I knew she forgets to eat when she's stressed. That's what I mean when I say I care about my family, not the performing, the actual showing up, the granola bar, the 30-minute drive at any hour if she calls. The rest of it, the approval, the narrative, the table dynamics, I have officially stopped auditioning for.